pass the screen over to you, and Lacey will do a little introduction to you as you get set up.
Thanks, Talia. So we're really thrilled to welcome Dr. Andrew Gonzalez, who's the co-chair of GEO BON and the IPBES Assessment on Biodiversity Monitoring, and the chair in Biodiversity Conservation at McGill University. Andy's work focuses on bridging cutting-edge ecological research with real-world policy applications, making him a leading voice in the global effort to translate biodiversity data into actionable policy. He's also playing a key advisory role in the development of the Move On initiative, helping to shape our collective vision for integrating animal movement data into global biodiversity frameworks. You can take it away, Andy.
Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction, Lacey. Thank you, Talia. Thank you both and Wild Labs for setting up this webinar. This, for me, is very exciting to be part of Behind the Buzz. And as always, I'm very happy to be on stage, so to speak, with Aydin, who's an awesome colleague and is helping me connect to IPBES and bridge our two amazing organizations. So allow me to share really some background on what is GEO BON and what are we doing, and some of my own reflections and thoughts on how we can bridge the work that you're all doing in the research and applied science space into the most pressing issue of our time, is how to deliver on the global biodiversity framework. Since December 2022, we have a new vision. We have a new theory of change in place, succinctly called the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And this framework sets out 4 ambitious goals to be achieved by 2050 and 23 targets to be achieved by 2030. Crucial to this is this idea of what we are saying colloquially as bending the curve of biodiversity. That means switching from a trajectory that would be considered to be a long-term unsustainable erosion of biological diversity in different ways, at different dimensions of biodiversity, and the many benefits and contributions that people receive from that. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. But what's key, I think, for the purposes of this talk is that we have a brand new monitoring framework with the GBF. This is something that was not formalized in the previous Aichi targets. And so what does that mean? That means that that it's asking countries to consistently report their progress in terms of bending the curve of nature, and reporting their progress across the headline indicators, of the targets and goals. Now, when we mean a monitoring framework, there's the UN speak, and then there's what we might all be thinking about. And so we include in that monitoring both the observations of nature, the movement of animals, the dispersal of plants, the levels of genetic species and ecosystem diversity and the functioning of those ecosystems. But we also mean the translation of that knowledge into policy relevant indicators and the reporting of that progress, a reliable process of going from observations to the reporting of progress. And that is what many organizations around the world are trying to institutionalize right now, and to set up a culture, a robust, open science culture for supporting countries with their monitoring frameworks. Now, here is a smattering of words from the GBF document, and I put in blue things that are relevant to this group. In just 3 paragraphs here, you can see the word connectivity and is explicit in the framing of target 2 around restoration, target 3 around protected areas. And I think it's important to take home that we don't just mean the connectivity of protected areas, but we mean connectivity at large, in the spaces between those connected areas, in the spaces where people are living, of course, and even in Goal B on ecosystem services and nature's contribution to people, we see already, for example, in Target 12 on cities, that connectivity is embedded in that wording. So getting this community on board and engaged in the movement and connectivity question is vital to the success of these targets and many others in the GBF framework. Now, let me take you from the biggest picture possible. This is the landscape of what we're trying to achieve. On the right, you see the UN CBD and the GBF framework interacting over time with IPBES and the community that's trying to assess the knowledge we have and to understand how the framing of the GBF matches with the overall knowledge that we are aggregating and synthesizing via IPBES and its various assessments. And on the left, you're seeing the global science and NGO and local communities that are committed to monitoring biodiversity change, understanding how that is happening at different spatial and temporal scales across different realms from freshwater, marine, and terrestrial systems. And our goal is to couple both sides of this figure. So how can we support the assessment of progress, us in our community on the left there, supporting those organizations on the right, and how do their policies, actions, and coordination of the knowledge assessment process on the right feed into our own priorities, and which organizations can stand up at this point and support this cycle. GEO BON is one of those critical organizations, and that little animation in the middle there is really an attempt to convey that we're expecting collaborations among organizations and among countries. Those could be bilateral and they could be multilateral, but they're part of this new system of systems that we're trying to build to inform our opportunity to meet those targets. Now, in this paper, just before COP15 in December of 2022, my co-chair, Maria Cecilia Londoño at the Humboldt Institute in Colombia, we put together some of the key issues that we felt needed to be addressed as we try to ready the biodiversity monitoring community for this action framing, this theory of change. And here is a list of the things we felt are critical and that were repeatedly expressed by countries. One is that there are significant data and indicator gaps, meaning in the context of movement, that means the availability of movement data and the availability of movement EBVs, as I'll get to in a minute, what an EBV is, and then the indicators we might use to support policy based on that knowledge. There are profound issues around data sovereignty, who gets to use information that's generated, who gets to share that data, who makes that available, and of course all the potential inequities that may arise from that and that exist today, but we want to minimize moving forward. Thirdly, that there are important workflows that allow us to take observations of movement or any aspect of nature and turn those reliably, transparently, and robustly into indicators. That right now is not done in a smooth and effective manner. Statistically, we want to be able to do very strong detection of change and attribution of the causes of that change, and to be able to act on that through a formal detection attribution framework, not least for movement, but of course all dimensions of biodiversity. And then that fifth piece is thinking about multilateral collaboration and for better outcomes, which is ultimately why we're all here. Now, on this slide, you're seeing kind of what's in my brain about how I think those two sides of that figure work together. On the demand of data production and sharing, number one, into the monitoring science, number two, planning and prioritization to meet our targets and goals, and then ultimately onto reporting. And you can think of it like a recipe. There are multiple ingredients that go into making this an effective workflow, a streamlined workflow where we've got representation and engagement from across those communities, from the observation communities, the formal and informal monitoring that's going on nationally and internationally. So GBio stands for the Global Biodiversity Observing System we're trying to build, the various technologies that are used and involved in that monitoring process, and then the monitoring science that provides layers of data, both in situ and remotely sensed, the knowledge services that allow us to turn those models and data sets into metrics and indicators that can then feed into the kind of smorgasbord of offerings that countries may want to use. These include the headline indicators, the binary indicators, the component, complementary, and national indicators that every country pulls together as they're defining their national biodiversity strategy and action plan that you see in orange. And it's from these indicators that they report their progress to the UNCBD. And then the UNCBD is committed from that reporting to aggregate understanding. So you can see how well this piece on the right is done depends fundamentally on how well we do on the left here, and how well we mobilize this movement community and establish a movement BON, Biodiversity Observation Network, and the indicators and models that flow from that are crucial to being able to streamline this process so that we are adequately supporting the policy context. So this is where GEOBON comes in. GEOBON's mission is to improve the acquisition, coordination, and delivery of biodiversity observations. We support a number and provide a number of indicators, and of course provide models that allow us to make projections of the status of those indicators and EBVs. And we try to deliver those in an open science framework to a broad set of users, as broad a set as possible. GEOBON is basically 15 years old now. It has accumulated 3,500 registered members. It's free to join and be part of this community, scattered across 150 countries, no less, and 1,800 organizations. So it's a remarkable community of experts. Over those 15 years, we've really focused on three things: developing the EBV framework, and most recently, the Essential Ecosystem Services framework, which complements the EBV framework, the indicators that are built from those EBVs, and developing this community of biodiversity observation networks, which is really building a coalition of the willing. Those are really willing to stand up a BON and engage with the rest of the BONs in the world. And then doing so in a way that is obviously made available to multilateral environmental agreements like the KMGBF, but of course like the Convention on Migratory Species, the SDGs, or any other MEA. How do we do that, and what do we do? Well, it's a hooking up of the research and observation community with the assessment and policy communities, meeting user needs in this iterative cycle shown by the gray square going around. GEOBON is built of working groups and task forces, and anyone can build a working group, and anyone can contribute to a task force. And so historically, we've had working groups that have developed EBVs, essential biodiversity variables, on a range of topics. Some of them you see here. We do not currently have an EBV for movement group, but that is an obvious thing that could be built immediately. And in addition to those working groups, we've had task forces on policy, for example, but also working groups that have contributed to the development of the biodiversity observation networks, and how the knowledge contributed by these working groups and task forces can feed into these policy assessment and policy processes. So that is what we've been busy doing at any given time, and what the Secretariat of GEOBON, which is based here in Montreal at McGill University, is dedicated to supporting the work of this very large and active community. And what our biggest, highest level mission is to fill in a gap. What you're seeing on this slide is the obvious absence of a global observing system that our climate community has, that our climate community has a range of weather and climate observing systems for all realms of our biosphere, and that supports the IPCC process. We do not have the equivalent to support the IPBES and the UNCBD process. And so GEOBON is really trying in the next few years to help stand up this network of networks, this BON of BONs that we call the Global Biodiversity Observing System. And so this has multiple components. The idea is to work with countries, but of course across countries, to support the engagement of that community in situ, the assessment of needs, the design of a BON, and the implementation of that BON, so that it's measuring the range of biodiversity indicators and those variables that we talked about earlier, and producing a knowledge service that can then be used as part of a collaborative international effort to measure the changing state of an EBV and ultimately those indicators, whether that's at the local scale, the regional, or global scales. So when we see a BON, this is what we see. We see a human component, networks of partners and organizations in the public and private sector collaborating around this data challenge, and then transforming that data into forms that can be used by partners to calculate indicators, feed into the policy process at different scales. And this is what we want to try to build. GeoBon has been successful in building a number of these. We have national bonds, a range of national bonds from China to Colombia to France to Finland. We've got regional collections of national bonds, like the Asia Pacific bond that connects 7 different countries. And then we've got these thematic bonds like marine bond, freshwater bond, and soil bond, where people are sharing technologies and knowledge that allow those communities represented by many different countries to share their understanding of how best to monitor change in those realms. And so you could imagine a thematic bond on movement, just as you could imagine national and regional bonds for movement. The idea is then, once we've built a bond, is that you've established a workflow from observations to EBVs and on up to the indicators. And here you see the list of indicators that GeoBon readily provides and has formalized that provision to the parties of the CBD. So that is one way in which the movement community can develop an EBV and a movement EBV, perhaps within the category of species traits, and on into the designation of contributing either to existing indicators or to the development of new indicators. I don't have too much time to go into what an EBV is. It's essentially a framework for collecting, sharing, and using biodiversity observations. It's done in a way that's open and open science, using best, fair, and care principles. As you'll notice, there are 6 classes of EBVs, from genetics to populations to species traits, compositions of communities, and on to the structure and function of ecosystems. And so connectivity and movement pertains to all of these, of course, and we can have a long conversation about the value of movement EBVs. But they all share these qualities, and developing an EBV must ensure that we hit that they are policy relevant, feasible, sensitive to change, generalizable across realms, scalable in space and time, and are the basis for robust indicators. Here's just another way of showing that information, but now you read it from bottom to top. We're trying to build the sandwich, the layer here from the primary data of the observations with dimensions of space and time, through to the EBVs, into the indicators, and then supporting countries that might be mobilizing those indicators to report on those targets. As I finish up and wrap up here, just to say that GeoBon has been working for the last 2 years to offer an open platform. This is called Bon in a Box. Bon in a Box is a community-contributed assembly of code, data, and protocols that allow a country to feed data into EBV pipelines, so codes, scripts, that allow us to then systematically, for a given area or region of the planet, turn those EBV data cubes with dimensions of space, time, and biodiversity into those indicators. And what we're doing is working with the CBD Secretariat to pipe in, to provide an API from Bon in a Box into the Convention on Biological Diversity's data framework, so that countries can more easily hook up their country-level monitoring science and data collection into this sort of standardized, rigorous process for reporting on this changing state of their indicators. Here is an example of what the Bon in a Box viewer looks like. We're working with the country of Guinea in West Africa to help them think about how connected their protected areas are, you see in orange, and can we help them calculate indicators for the connectivity of their protected areas, and doing so with this community-contributed framework that Bon in a Box offers. And so this is my last slide. It's my kind of challenge slide of what does a movement bond do? This is going to be fodder for conversation. I don't want to prescribe too much of this, but just to understand that what we're maybe trying to do in the process of brainstorming, creating, and standing up a movement bond that is gathering information about how organisms are moving in different ecosystems, contexts. How can we build robust evidence of movement change and connectivity change that feeds into these indicators that guide planning and conservation action, that can allow regular reporting to the CBD under its goals and targets? And how can that robust knowledge provide indicators of progress towards those connectivity targets that then support national reporting via this pathway, as well as this planning pathway. If we build this system, wow, we will have shifted the entire community to a level of maturity that will see it, I think, bear fruit in our capacity to deliver progress and bend the curve of connectivity and habitat loss, and ultimately for those contributions that we realize are essential to humanity as well as to nature in goals A and B of the GBF. So with that, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Andy. Lots of fodder for discussion. So we're going to take a little bit of time to do Q&A. And it looks like, has anyone dropped? I don't think if you want to ask a new question, please drop it into the chat. I have one to kick us off that was pulled from some of the registration questions. So I think given that a lot of folks in the audience right now are kind of from the science or tech world, we often struggle with the level of information that people want. And so how would you advise us on like how to think about getting our, pretty complicated movement models into a level of information or a format that would be meaningful to policymakers?
Wow. That's an important conversation and with many layers to it. So ultimately, when you, for example, if you sit in on COP negotiations, I was there a lot in terms of the negotiations around the monitoring framework, and they are ongoing, and they were a sticky issue at COP16, and there will be a sticky issue probably at COP 16.2 in Rome in a couple of weeks. What you understand, what we appreciate is that the countries that are negotiating choices of indicators for movement, for example, are not aware of what the community is producing. There are a few countries which have scientists sitting on their delegations. Colombia is one of them. My dear co-chair, Maria Cecilia, sits on the Colombian delegation. So that they have an enormous head start. And she is able to work with those teams so that they can assess what is good and strong science. But that can't be ad hoc like that. So what we need is a community of this community to make readily available and to communicate clearly the state of readiness of our workflows, of our models, and the confidence that we have in those models that they can be used relatively readily by countries. So some countries are blessed with an institute, a Humboldt Institute, for example, where the government can lean on that institute for the relevant expertise. And so in the layer cake of information sharing and mainstreaming of that knowledge, it passes through that funnel. Now, the CBD has just developed a list of regional technical and scientific support centers. There are 23, I believe, around the world that are dedicated to working as this middle layer. And so what I'm excited about doing is to have GEO BON work with these 23 centers to kind of spread the word and support the implementation of let's stick to movement models and movement data. So imagine if we could provide those recipes, that knowledge, that confidence to those centers, and then they can work with countries that do not have a Humboldt or a Sanby or whatever the institution might be, the Smithsonian or whatever it is. So what I'm saying is that right now we have an ad hoc process. It's a bit random, and what gets selected in a negotiation is not necessarily built on a widely acknowledged and widely understood knowledge base. So it's upon us as a community, and that's why GEO BON exists in part, is to streamline that information, get it into the hands of those that are negotiating, but then crucially beyond the negotiations, getting that into a ready culture of use of this information and knowledge. And those centers are a good way to go.
That's great, Andy. I was, as you were talking, wondering about these centers and if there was a connection there. So that's really exciting to hear, and something to explore more. I think Lacey and I have more questions we can maybe save for the broader discussion, but it looks like there are a couple in the chat. I'm not sure, Omar, do you have a mic that you could jump in with?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Okay, Oh, yes. Yeah, go for it.
Great. So my question was about the difference between national bonds and the M bond. Well, specifically, I wrote about the M bond, but the subject-specific bonds. I understand the general difference, but what would you say, me as an NGO, should I contact the regional bond, the national bond, the area-specific bonds? Where do they overlap in some cases? Because obviously there is some overlapping in data collection and analysis. So if you could go a bit into that, I would love that. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a great question, sort of very pragmatic and important to understand. So that, as I said before, that there's often very strong national representation in these thematic bonds, and some countries obviously can contribute more times of energy and sometimes even financial support. So the Marine Bond has a secretariat. That secretariat's job is not just to support the efforts of mobilizing marine monitoring in any one country, but to support in an umbrella effort the efforts of many that are monitoring marine systems around the world. So their scope, their spatial scope, is international. They also have their own working groups. Sometimes they have a task force that might, for example, connect to OBIS, right? The information system, the Ocean Biodiversity Information System, or to GOOS, the Global Ocean Observing System. And so MBON has been very strong in providing a weighty implementation of that knowledge and linking it into GOOS and OBIS, which has allowed a pathway of essential ocean variables and those EBVs that are relevant to oceans into the marine bond community and then into OBIS and to GOOS. So it's trying to represent that effort rather than an implementation, for example, of a national bond that would have marine representations. You'd have marine bond representation in a France bond, right? And then IFREMER or whatever it is, there's some sort of marine institute that's on the south coast that's trying to monitor EBVs. They would be doing that for their national interest, but would be also linking to the thematic one. I'll just close on the soil bond because maybe that's the most recent. So soil bond emerged from a contribution of a few soil biologists. One of them was one of the co-chairs based in IDIV in Leipzig in Germany, and said, hey, we need to get together the soil community and provide a service that allows them to share samples, provide a systematic measurement and quantification of the diversity of those soil samples, and then share that knowledge. So they're sharing protocols, they're sharing data, and they're coordinating webinars and thematic sessions and EBVs and publishing papers on how to bring together that community. And they're a very nice recent model for, I think, a movement bond, which is clearly thematic in its first framing.
Wonderful. Well,
Thank you very much.
Oh, sorry, Omar. Thank you so much, Andy, for that wonderful overview. Thanks for the questions to the community.